It remained to Napoleon nothing but to confide the destiny of this great undertaking to the most splendid army which he had ever put into the field, wishing to dispose of all his forces to strike a great blow, and to return promptly to Spain, where during 2 years he kept a detachment of his household with the Chamberlain Brigade, equerries, brigades of horses, and pack mules, an entire campaign outfit. He awaited the moment for beginning the war, to which he had been forced, with confidence in his strength and in his right. He did not, however, lose all hopes of avoiding it, and up to the crossing of the Niemen tried to flatter himself that some arrangement was still possible. The emperor took advantage of every opportunity to reach Alexander's heart. He had a real affection for this prince, and a confidence in his private character, which was not justified by events. He was convinced that an hour's conversation with him in private would end in a complete understanding. Later on, when hostilities were at their height, and whilst the chances of war were not yet unfavorable to him, Napoleon ordered Alexander to be written to. He even wrote to him personally by every way, either on the occasion of the passage of the flags of truce, which the exchange of some Russian generals who had been taken prisoners brought to his headquarters, or under other circumstances when, for example, he was trying to minimize the evils caused by the barbarity with which the Russians acted in this most murderous war. The atmosphere of the court, the habit which Marie Louise had of living familiarly with the emperor, who paid her a great deal of attention, treated her with simple and affectionate manners, and often amused her with a gaiety which was often animated, had caused this princess to forget the stiffness and reserve which she owed to her natural timidity at the time of her arrival in France. Her bearing became easy. She had become somewhat less stout, in her figure, which was of perfect symmetry, had very much improved. Fine eyes full of sweetness and a beautifully fresh complexion gave to her face an agreeable expression, and rendered the ensemble of her person both noble and graceful. Weighed down by duties and cares on the eve of a rupture with Russia, the emperor's time was taken up with multifarious occupations of his cabinets, with reviews, and with the work of his ministers. It was only with his wife and his son that he found agreeable relief from so much fatigue. The little leisure which his affairs left him in the daytime was spent with his son, whose tottering steps it pleased him to guide with quite a womanly care. The frequent falls of this cherished child, when they had not been prevented, were greeted with caresses and loud shouts of laughter by his father. The empress, who used to be present at these family scenes, did not take so active a part in them as the emperor. These three persons, whose simplicity might have led one to forget their greatness, offered the spectacle of a middle-class family attached to each other by the fondest affection. Who could then have thought of the fate which was reserved to them? This great man, whom so many prejudiced or mistaken minds have been pleased to represent as being inaccessible to any tender sentiment, was both a good husband and an excellent father. Never did the empress find in him the censor of her innocent whims. The following anecdote, which Marie Louise used to be fond of calling to mind, shows the good nature of Napoleon in this respect. The remembrance of a taste which she had acquired in the very homely sort of life she had led when quite a girl inspired one day the empress with the desire to make an omelette herself, and she had had all the necessary ingredients brought into her apartment. Whilst completely taken up with her very important culinary operation, the emperor entered without having been announced, either by chance or because he had heard from some officious person what was going on, and wanted to have the pleasure of surprising Marie Louise. The latter, somewhat upset by this unexpected visit, endeavored to prevent Napoleon from seeing what she was preparing. "What is going on here?" asked the emperor. "There is a singular smell, as if something was being fried." Then, stepping behind the empress, he discovered the spirit lamp, the silver frying pan in which the butter was beginning to melt, the salad bowl, and the eggs. "What?" cries Napoleon. "So you are making an omelette? Bah, you don't know how to do it at all. I will show you how it is to be done." He then set to work, the Empress acting as his assistant, but he was trying to teach an assistant who knew more about it than he did, and whose education had been obtained in a very lofty school. The Empress's parents were passionately fond of rustic occupations, loving to withdraw into some rustic home built in the center of great imperial parks, and there disguised as farmers to attend to household duties with their children. The omelette then having been finished somehow or other, there remained the important operation of tossing it. Napoleon wanted to do this himself, but he had thought himself cleverer than he was. And just as he was trying to toss the omelette, there happened to him what happened to the great Condé, who, according to Gourville, wished to make an omelette at an inn where he had stopped and pitched it into the fire when trying to turn it. Napoleon did not succeed any better and let the omelette fall on the ground. He was then obliged to confess his want of experience and left the Empress to go on with her cooking alone. In the spring of 1812, the Emperor was enabled by the return of the fine weather to add to his family amusements, excursions on horseback and hunts, in which the Empress followed him either Saint-Cloud or Rambouillet, residences of which he was fond because he was surrounded by fewer people and was more at liberty. Sometimes at break of day, he would wake the Empress to go out riding with her. Together with Marie Louise, he would ride through the beautiful woods which surround Saint-Cloud. Some of these rides had a fixed and useful object, either in the direction of Paris or in the surroundings. On some occasions, the sovereigns went to pay a visit to the works of embellishment or improvement which had been commanded by Napoleon. The guardians of these works were sometimes taken by surprise, fast asleep, by these sudden visits, and would look at these new inspectors with amazement, believing themselves in the presence of a vision. As these excursions were never announced in advance, the aide-de-camp and equerry in attendance, together with 2 or 3 outriders, formed the whole party. The Empress was never accompanied by one of her ladies. Some of these used to meet her on her return, or wait for her in her apartment. Marie Louise used to get into the carriage which followed them when she felt tired. But this happened but rarely. The Emperor always came back from these excursions, whether he went out alone or with Marie Louise, with some idea for improving or perfecting the works in his mind. If he found on his road some piece of work to which his attention had been directed, he would examine in person to what an extent the carrying out of such a work would be useful. At the first glance, Napoleon would take a survey of the site and of the works which had been begun, forming a just idea of the best way in which they could be directed, of their duration, and of the expense which they would occasion. On his return, he would commission his ministers to call together their heads of departments, the engineers and scientific men, and unite them in a council over which he used to preside. On hearing the reading of their reports, he would apply to them the first notions which he had gathered on the spot itself, having determined in his head in what way the works might be perfected. In spite of the rapidity of his examination, he had generally made himself as fully acquainted thereby with all the details of the work as the specialists who had made it the object of their constant studies could have done. Nature lavished upon Napoleon the faculties which she reserves to privileged beings created to command, to conduct, and to enlighten mankind. She had endowed him with a vivid and ardent imagination united with a cold reasoning power. She had endowed him with genius fortified by study, which the most prolonged and arid labor could not wear out, and which, on the contrary, drew fresh stores of vigor from the diversity of his occupations. She had endowed him with a vast mind, which embraced the ensemble of the widest questions, of which descended to the most minute details. She had endowed him with a really extraordinary conception, to which sudden flashes revealed the deepest depths of human knowledge. She had endowed him with a prodigious memory. To these gifts of intelligence, there was added in Napoleon a lofty and sensitive mind, but a mind which was strongly tempered, and which rose superior to the blows as to the favors of fortune. His sang-froid was unalterable in the midst of danger, as though he had felt himself invulnerable. A persevering and inflexible will, an instinct of power and superiority which broke down all obstacles, made him smile at the word impossible or deny its existence. The study of the human heart had taught him the art of attaching men to him and of subjugating them. His presence and his language excited enthusiasm. His eloquence was vivacious and rapid. His words were energetic, profound, and often sublime. His simple exterior, simple, but heightened with an air of grandeur and by the habit of command. The fascination of his look, whose sweet or severe expression penetrated to the bottom of all hearts, inspired respect mingled with fear and affection. Never was there a more popular leader in history, and yet he would never consent to lower himself to acquire such popularity. His vigilance was constantly on the alert to reform abuses of every kind, to discover means of raising France to the eminence where his genius dreamt of placing her. At the same time, the indefatigable activity of his body and mind induced him to practice the principle that one should not let others do what one could do himself. The main feeling of what is just and what is unjust dominated with him. So far above other men, he was, whatever may have been said, superior to its passions. He knew how to pity the weakness and the misery of the human heart, although as a general rule he was indulgent towards faults and errors. He had thought it sometimes necessary to rebuke severely in public those who had committed them, lest to punish those to whom his reproaches were addressed. Then, for an example, and to impress the minds of those who witnessed these scenes, his severity usually limited itself to this: often clement towards his adversaries. He was reluctant to act against them and ended by becoming their victim. Those who have represented his government as a type of military domination have not noticed what a little part in the power Napoleon, who was adored by the army, gave to his lieutenants, and with what care he maintained his soldiers in a state of submission to civil authority. Endowed in the supremest degree with military genius, the reputation of the most illustrious captains pales before his, and yet it is not only to the glory of his army that he owed his reputation and his empire. He was an administrator, a politician, a legislator, a writer, even a savant, and indeed everything that he wished to be, as well as a great soldier. The constant object of his labors, of his conquests, an object which time did not allow him to attain, can be summed up in one phrase: to assure to all men the full exercise and the entire enjoyment of all their faculties. It was Napoleon himself who attributed to himself this lofty ambition, nor will posterity deny him the merit of it. His thoughts, his actions, his very ambition converged towards this lofty object: to regenerate the nations, to scatter broadcast amongst them opinions of progress, together with enlightenment, to bestow everywhere and on all classes the inalienable privileges of civil and political liberty. Preoccupied with his lofty ambition and with the duty of protecting the future of France against the hatreds of the old world Europe, Napoleon was necessarily forced in the development of his measures for enforcing his conceptions to clash with many prejudices and to wound many and various susceptibilities. In putting aside the obstacles which impeded his onward march, he could not help injuring many interests of all kinds, having fallen in the midst of his glorious and laborious career. The elevation of his ideas and the object of his plans have escaped the eye of the vulgar, who only judge by success. Those whom fortune has abandoned are generally judged with but little indulgence. Napoleon has remained, after his fall, a prey to attacks which are often unjust and undeserved. Even at the same time at which I am writing, he has not yet been judged with sufficient impartiality, and yet the hatred of him is dying out. Passion is losing its force. Prejudices are becoming dissipated, and the minds of men enlightened. The path traced out by his genius, the object towards which he marched, will appear one day freed from the clouds which so long shrouded them in darkness. This is what, in my opinion, will happen for Napoleon, whose glory the future can only increase. In his private relations, Napoleon was simple, natural, an observer of forms towards himself as well as towards others, of easy manners in his family life, generous and benevolent. He had orderly morals, religious sentiments, and great tolerance. He was a good father, a good husband, a good son, and a good brother. Napoleon applied to the acts of his public life the qualities which he had in his private life and which were inherent in his nature. This respect for morality he exacted from his ministers and from the functionaries of state. Not only did he seek in those whom he associated with his labors for talents appropriated to the lofty posts which were entrusted to them, but also a scrupulous probity, a spirit of equity and justice, and honorable morals. Those whom the nature of their functions put into direct relations with him distinguished themselves by these qualities, with one or two exceptions, in the case of men who were necessary to him, and who, by reasons of prudence or superior political motives, could not be definitely removed from his counsels. Those who, by reason of the secondary importance of their functions, did not approach his person, were nonetheless the objects of his attention. Abuses, acts contrary to the respect with which he wished his agents to be surrounded, were immediately repressed by severe reprimands or punished by dismissal. It must be added that never was sovereign so well served or inspired so much devotion. Never under any reign were services of any kind and of every kind less exposed to hazards, more independent of caprice, or less liable to be forgotten. Those who served Napoleon well were always largely recompensed. On the 18th Brumaire, the future emperor had found France the prey to the most fatal dissensions, and the care of uniting the French in the common interest of national prosperity and greatness became his constant preoccupation. Everybody of any value of France, both under the consulate and the empire, was summoned by the head of the government without distinction of caste or of opinion to help him in the task of reorganizing the state, of founding French unity and nationality, and laying the basis of that vigorous administration which Napoleon bequeathed to his successors. All citizens, both in civil and military life, seconded Napoleon with zeal and fidelity, for the spirit and will of the nation were personified in him. In brief, there were united in the same man all the great qualities which I have only given in outline, crowned with an ardent love for his country. After the signing of the treaties with Austria and Prussia at the beginning of 1812, of which I have already spoken, the emperor decided to pay a visit to Dresden before proceeding to the army. He proposed to assemble his allies there. He had not given up all hope of avoiding the great struggle which was preparing. Napoleon spoke to the empress of his intention of inviting the Emperor of Austria to meet him in the capital of the King of Saxony. The Empress Marie Louise received this proposal with great pleasure, for it was her warmest wish to see her father and her family, with whom she kept up regular correspondence once more. In consequence, Count Otto, our ambassador in Vienna, was commissioned to invite the Emperor Francis to come to Dresden with the Empress and the Archdukes and Archduchesses, brothers and sisters of Marie Louise, who looked forward with pleasure to spending some days with them. The necessity of coping with the serious difficulties caused by the lack of wheat, with which France was threatened, delayed the emperor's departure to Dresden for a month. Since 1811, the scarcity of wheat had been felt, and this scarcity had developed towards the beginning of 1812 in a manner to cause anxiety. Extraordinary measures and an allotment of 25 million francs for the purpose of reducing the price of bread, ample daily distributions of cheap soups, and above all the promise of a good harvest dispelled this danger. The emperor displayed under these circumstances the activity which he knew how to apply to all things. Every 2 days he presided over councils of maintenance to which he summoned competent men, and his solicitude and foresight extended to the minutest details of the question. At the time of engaging in a distant and hazardous expedition, the emperor feared that during an absence which might be prolonged, the English whose ships were cruising before Genoa might attempt to forcibly remove the Pope from Savona in order to make of the head of the Catholic Church a docile instrument in their hands, in spite of the fact that their hands were the hands of heretics. With a view of providing against this eventuality, he ordered that the Holy Father should be invited to go to Fontainebleau in order to remove him out of the sphere of English intrigues. At the same time, Napoleon summoned the Archbishop of Edessa to Fontainebleau, thinking that the society of this prelate, who was much liked by the Pope, would be both agreeable and useful to his holiness.